Hi, everyone. Thanks a lot for coming to e-flux tonight, this evening, on such a beautiful day also. Oh, hey, Rob. Hey, how are you? Um, yeah, it's a real pleasure to introduce Gean Moreno, who's visiting us in town from Miami, where he's a curator at Miami ICA. And Gean, apart from being a really spectacular writer, is also guest editor of two major issues of e-flux Journal. The issue on accelerationist aesthetics, which was from nearly 4 years ago in June 2013, and more recently, As the World Falls Apart from February of this year, which dealt with the movement for Black Lives. And yeah, with the former issue, with the accelerationist issue, of course, this is I have to confess that this is an issue that sometimes I have kind of misgivings and slight regrets about, considering the way that kind of accelerationist discourse has started to have a strange, parallel with certain sentiments and ultra-nationalist kind of extremist tendencies in the right-wing parts of our society and other societies. But so I'm always kind of consoled by the fact that Gean was the guest editor of this issue, and I think it helps to think back to the very first issue, or the very, very first text that Gean wrote with Ernesto Arosa for an issue of e-flux Journal in May of 2009, the sixth issue of e-flux Journal, which was called Learning from Little Haiti, where Gean and Ernesto dealt with the neighborhood of Little Haiti in Miami, and the kind of improvised architecture and improvised form making that people in this community would use, and I think this is a kind of very interesting thing to think about in relation to the more sci-fi testosterone-driven kind of accelerationist discourse. And I'll just read a small segment before handing it over to Gean. Whereas the global approaches of modern architecture relied on criteria extrapolated from an imaginary and ideal future, these new practices aim to start with an understanding of what exactly is needed and possible at a local level. Teleology is replaced with radical pragmatics. Analysis and sober prognosis replace sweeping, emancipatory desires and pronouncements, opening up the possibility of an imminent architecture or design that arises from real contextual constraints and needs, from an understanding of the urban ecologies into which the structures or objects are introduced. It means working from a clearer understanding of form, space, and material as active entities, as themselves types of information or creative forces that interact with one another. System is given priority over thing, software or program over product, framework over object. What we end up with matters, of course, but how we end up with it, a hyper-awareness of the foundational processes, is perhaps more important. There's a general tendency in certain quarters to move away from the designing of individual artifacts, whether these are entire neighborhoods, buildings, or chairs, to designing systems that themselves produce the artifacts, systems typically responsive in some way to the insubstantial flows that crisscross cities. In other words, it becomes a matter of instituting processes that generate forms. Let's give a warm welcome to Gean Moreno.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Brian, and thank you to e-flux for the invitation and for letting me do all kinds of things on their platforms, of which I can then hide back home and they have to deal with it. And so I know that the impulse of this series is kind of to cut against a little bit the informality of talks that we have in the art world and that sort of thing, and recover some of a bit more formal structure. So I will both please and disappoint, right? So I have a written thing that I'm going to read, so that's the pleasing part. The disappointing part might be that it's just testing some new material, so it might crash and burn along the way. So it's called The Fascinating Prospect, the lecture. And it has multiple sections. So the first section is called Footnotes in the Morphological Archive. It says, beyond generating the default image of the desolate planet with whirlwinds of ash and gray gravel roads, the assignment of imagining human extinction, the black-dyed edge of what we can call the imagination of climate change, doesn't seem to even allow us the small victory of being some kind of biochemical configuration that should be singled out. It simply reslots us in a chemical informational continuum, in a universal morphological archive that adds material to itself continuously. It reminds us that we are the outcome of processes that were set in motion long before we were around, and that will continue long after we're after. Processes that will fold us back into their unbroken line of incessant mutation, swallowing any trace we leave behind. There's, of course, something dazzling in the fact that our transient biochemical configuration results from extremely weird processes like apoptosis and transduction, or that cells and dynamic exchanges generate certain abilities like metabolism and self-repair to keep the body that houses them flourishing, or that consciousness emerged as one of its complex and mystifying properties, or that through collective effort it distilled incessant mutation into the controllable dynamic of labor, rearranging metabolic temples with our surroundings. None of this, however, should discourage too forcefully any desire to debunk feel-good exercises engineered to puff up our anthroposteem. The dazzle, after all, is in the fact that all this happens, and yet, in some way, we are not. Not in the larger picture, and not in the smaller one when salutary and unflinching, which traces us as a swarm of chemical and informational transactions. Made of millions of cells, and yet, as Daniel Dennett puts it, and I quote, not a single one of the cells that compose you knows who you are or cares. The individual cells that compose you are alive, but we now understand life well enough to appreciate that each cell is a mindless mechanism, a largely autonomous microbot, not more conscious than a yeast cell. That's the end of the quote. In negative relief, the more accurate picture, we're temporary aggregates of millions of tiny information processing devices. What we learn, ultimately, is that what seems basic to us is the generic condition of mutability, which is not our condition as such, but rather a condition that we're in, a universal substrate or infrastructure from which we are ineradicable. We're caught in it like the blobs that transact in Alan McCullum's The Shape Project, 2005 until after he dies. That's the temporal length of that project. It's a combinatorial system of shapes through which the artist is attempting to represent every living person, and at the moment when global population peaks in 2050, through a unique biomorphic blob. McCullum's shapes proliferate as if undetermined by any subjective regulating protocol, and they seem uninterested in conforming to the metrics that correlate to human capacities. They're generated by combining 300 elementary components designed as vector files on Adobe Illustrator, which can produce 31 billion unrepeated morphologies when linked in different combinations. This cannot help but remind us that digital tools belong to the moment when labor assumed new traits, and the production of exchange value continued at the expense of irrevocable injury to the very platform, the earth itself, that sustains this operation, setting us down a particular path of swelling death. In terms of medium, how can we classify the Shapes project? Mediatic indeterminacy is not insignificant here or in anything that McCullum produces. His project is always traded in decoys, blanks, vehicles, and surrogates, right? That's the general kind of art historical narrative. But whatever it is, the Shapes project seems to enlist a logic of program execution and algorithm, and also of souvenir, memento, and puzzle. Finding fecund soil in the go-to forms of a popular culture doesn't need to be warehoused in the spectacle buildings of the museum or the corporate gallery, alerting us to McCullum's ever-present desire to pressure the relationship between culture artifacts and the protocols that organize their consumption. If the Shapes project serves as an illustration for us here, it's because it seems to become drained of any model and impulse to capture the good diversity of the species. McCullum's project is after something cold and profound, a celebration of a morphological restlessness that rages beneath banal crystallizations of individuality. Perhaps some of this reading is sustained through comparison. In 2004, McCullum generated the Each and Every One of You project, for which 1,200 common names were printed on 4x6 cards. So Maria, Patricia, Linda, Barbara, Brian, Thomas, etc. The name is a marker of distinction among similars, as a signal of specificity wrought from generic biological substance. It's precisely what has been extricated from the Shapes project, leaving behind a black hole that swallows and inverts everything. It may even be a conceptual drain around which conventional readings of McCollum's work spin and vanish. What matters in the work, in lieu of portraiture and naming, is variability and permutation, the idea of cold heterogeneity always in flight from itself, in an incessant drive toward further differentiation. That is, shape-shifting without teleological guidance, but propelled through agitated engagement with evolving dynamics and constraints, and with the emergent properties that result from the exchanges. The little blobs are snapshots of arrestive moments in this unfolding. Perhaps each one does represent a person, but is already a future fossil on the way to becoming a footnote in a universal morphological archive. While refusing to repeat any form combination, the Shapes project breaks down the uniqueness of its composite shapes into a collection of emblem blobs, differences at once there and not there, contingent and absolute, irreducible and insignificant. Just as a difference to which each of us as a claimant cannot help but oscillate in this way before a speculative view from the threshold of extinction. One should keep in mind that beyond works that reference conventional art typologies, McCollum has on a number of occasions found interest in artifacts that put extinction at the center of things. His natural copies from the coal mines of central Utah, for instance, are casts of dinosaur tracks that Utah miners excised from the mine walls and brought to a museum. Looking at this, knowing that Utah is central to the story, one cannot help but conjure for a moment the ghost of Robert Smithson here. Right, so this is a spiral jetty reemerging. Smithson's fascination with cycles that exceed conventional anthropocentric metrics, and with the Earth itself, and with dinosaurs, can be conscripted as background elements to reinforce what we're getting at here. Smithson wrote, following what he called the inevitable muddy thinking that comes from digging into the planet, and then I quote, "The strata of the Earth is a jumbled museum. Embedded in the sediments is a text that contains limits and boundaries that evade the rational order and social structures which confine art. In order to read the rocks, we must become aware of geological time and of the layers of prehistoric material that is entombed in Earth's crust. When one scans ruined sites of prehistory, one sees a heap of wrecked maps that upset our present art historical limits. A rubble of logic confronts the viewer as he looks into the levels of the sedimentations." That's the end of the quote. One of the reasons that looking over the sedimentary layers matters is because they're harbingers or prefigurations of future layers in which our presence will be widely inscribed into the very geology of the planet. The material entombed in the layers will have our fingerprints all over it, to say nothing of the reasons why it got there. As Smithson reminds us, remote futures meet remote pasts. And after all, what would the terrain around a threshold of extinction from where we cast our speculative view look like, if not Slav Higgs in his Oberhausen photos? Mm-hmm. Okay. All right, this part is called Coruscating a Dark Sparkle. All right, so extinction used to be fascinatingly frightening news when it seemed far-fetched and its possibility was activated far away, when it only pressed on indigenous populations, colonial subjects, and other species. Perhaps the fright this news bore was simply a stubborn reminder of responsibility for benefits bestowed by imperial and settler expansion that we accepted without too much of a dust-up, so as not to stir the comfort of our metropolitan lives. Now that climate refuses to stay far off, beyond some horizon that shielded us from violent transactions and their consequences, we have found a strange enthusiasm to probe extinction's offerings, to thinking and symbolic production, attenuating some of the scare it put in us and turning it instead into an intellectual bleakness endowed with a surprising margin of generative possibility. Extinction becomes, after all, once its possibility envelops the totality of the planet and our species, as Eugene Thacker writes, and I quote, "The impossible thought with not even a single human being to think the absence of all human beings, with no thought to think the negation of all thought." That's the end of the quote. It's a fascinating prospect to redline our conceptual mechanisms with, to try to tussle with on the way to finding plastic form for it. But one wonders if the notion of extinction, seductive as it may be in pushing thinking against its edge, in dragging cultural production to penumbral corners, should have settled with such ease in our intellectual transactions? Shouldn't instead blight our mood, at least a little bit? It would, I think, if the version we're transacting with was accompanied by the capacity to put in our path reminders of current struggles against eradication, usually erased from the scene of dabbling with vertiginous end-of-the-line scenarios, unfathomable measures of time, and the cosmic abyss. One should remember specific things like this. In 2008, it was determined that 28 indigenous groups residing in Colombian National Territory were facing imminent extinction. 18 groups had less than 100 members left. By 2010, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees had raised the number to 34 communities. Instead of focusing on things like these, however, we developed theoretical and artistic explorations around extinction as it was simply a matter of a fresh start to thinking about spooky noumena, unforgiving mind-independent worlds, fascinating non-anthropocentric time, an uber creepy real, the great outdoors. And this feels symptomatic, less of a newfound perspective fed by cosmic vistas and sensitivity to long duration, than of an incapacity to affect our immediate material conditions and political landscapes, of a swelling sense of impotence before incessant crisis and social disintegration. While I don't think that a fascination with extinction is completely compensatory, there is much disenchanting of the world that comes with it. It simply feels that in going about it the way we do, we often abdicate political gravity and settle for pop pessimism and academic disenchantment. We read Ligotti and Lovecraft and Schopenhauer. We return to the leotard of the dying sun. 4.5 billion years, he tells us. This is how long the sun has before it explodes. The planet will be pulverized by then. Needless to say, barring interstellar exiles of one sort or another, and the binding of distant astral bodies and their chemical economies to our historical trajectory, we're bound to go. Solar death primes the imagination against what science ostensibly permits, to trade in images of a scorched terrestrial platform full of crispy corpses. The smell of charred flesh that inevitably peels off this image has wafted from the future into the horizon of current thinking. And thinking, in turn, has repurposed some of its regions for the task of exfoliating all that this impingement entails. These regions coruscate the dark sparkle of giddy enthusiasm, even as they try to camouflage it with tenebrous things like black metal and supernatural horror and dread noise. These are things that signal the severe moods that a heightened awareness of our collective vanishment unleashes. After all, once we apprehend the magnitude of something like solar catastrophe, or something less operatic but equally world-busting, which of course puts an end to measly dreams of surviving clans on a devastated terrestrial platform, we have to concede that everything seems to carry the taint of insignificance. Is the pace slower, or am I still like going slow? I was worried about that the whole time. As Ray Brazier reminds us in his impossible to imitate way, and I quote, "Everything is dead already. Solar death is catastrophic because it vitiates ontological temporality as configured in terms of philosophical questioning's constitutive or horizontal relationship to the future. But far from laying in wait for us in the far distant future, on the other side of the terrestrial horizon, the solar catastrophe needs to be grasped as something that has already happened. As the aboriginal trauma driving the history of terrestrial life as an elaborately circuitous detour from stellar death, terrestrial history occurs between the simultaneous strophes of a death which is at once earlier than the birth of the first unicellular organism and later the extinction of the last multicellular animal." That's the end of the quote. If this aboriginal trauma is partly charged by the inevitability of solar catastrophe as a force that comes from the future to place everything in a paradoxical condition of something like living posthumousness, it finds the rest of its voltage from the fact that solar death has always already pulverized the Earth as a stable horizon. It has been pulverizing it from the beginning. Solar termination redraws the Earth not as a bottom line or originary site, not as home or horizon, but as a temporary coagulation in a continuum of cosmic transactions of matter and energy. We, simple bipeds who gulp frantically at the slightest discontinuity in oxygen flow, are minor incidents in these transactions. Infinitesimal bleeps registered and appreciated in stories that have significance only for the insignificant audience that at once crafts them and sits to listen. In the euphoria of self-satisfied nothings casting themselves as everything. As Lyotard reminds us, The solar explosion the mere thought of that explosion should awaken you from this euphoria. All right. So the next section is called our Stockholm Syndrome. What is it that has forced the Aboriginal trauma of solar catastrophe and other scenarios that underscore disappearance from making itself felt now? Of course, the obvious answer is that imminent and predictable down-the-road environmental catastrophes, to say nothing of the specter of full system collapse attributable to anthropogenic effects, has us pondering full biological annihilation and sipping from the subterranean spring of pessimism that comes with it, allowing its dark juices to flood so much of our thinking and so suffuse so many of our effective transactions with the world. Climate's growing presence in culture and quotidian consciousness sheds some light on things, but it hardly provides a satisfactory explanation for our eagerness to tarry so enthusiastically with the demise of the biological, to mend our foundational scission with the inorganic. Addressing this question, querying the enthusiasm, seems to me to require recourse to something of a logic of the furl, something like Freud's Nachtruck-like, translated into an informal tool to pick up on a collective dynamic. We need two ideological moments then. The emergence of climate, and this is a great kind of definition from Claire Colebrook. He says, climate as the milieu that is necessary for our ongoing life and as the fragile surface that holds us all together in one web of risk life, even if we cannot practically grasp or manage the dynamics of its totality. That's the end of the quote. So the emergence of climate opens the valve for the Aboriginal trauma to exert the full reserve of its pathogenic power. In fact, more than this, the Aboriginal trauma, in some sense, perhaps at the level of collective human intellect or real effective actualization, didn't exist until the retroactive investment of climate codes it as an active force. Our present makes us susceptible to it, and once activated or realized, rendered traumatic as such, endowed with the capacity to wound, the problem shifts to a need to mediate its hostile effects. This is how we find the Aboriginal trauma, synecdoche of a robust inventory of life-terminating scenarios, and the extinction that it underwrites, hostage to an excessive excitation and interest, to our sudden at-homeness in thinking the worst, and having the worst so at home in thinking. It has taken us, but in an effort to disarticulate its force, we have taken it. We have become the Patty Hearst of our promised annihilation. Beyond the anxiety it produces, climate has generated a shadow-effective economy to absorb the fact that now, through the advances of contemporary science, we can thoroughly understand their going away as irrefutable. The fascination with its extinction in this economy seems to serve a therapeutic function of allowing us to absorb this new common sense, in the process establishing certain modes of engaging the world which structure the nihilistic facet of the imagination of climate change. All right, next section is called Us is a Motley Crew. So it says, the temporal displacement that characterizes the notion of living posthumousness that solar catastrophe bestows on us finds reflection, double and opposite, in the future slant of Anthropocenic discourses. If solar extinguishment and climate overwrite things at the springing up of life, if they articulate something in the deep past, the Anthropocene is a mark that will be fully legible in the geological record of the planet in some distant future. And this is another quote from Claire Colebrook. So he says, stratigraphy at present is a mode of reading past layers, but the positing of the Anthropocene era relies on looking at our own world and imagining it as it will be when it has become the past. In imagining this world after humans, we're reading what is not yet written or inscribed. That's the end of the quote. That the Anthropocene has to ultimately be ratified through future reading alerts us to the fact that the imagination of climate change is always dealing with things that may be out of place. The exercise of imagining full human extinction in its therapeutic mode is not absolved from this. What seems more place in it is a discursively invented, undifferentiated humanity. I lost my place. A smooth-through anthropos laminated from the variegated and uneven textures of the world and of history. The us in the world without us is a motley crew. Numerous critiques have emerged around the production of this undifferentiated humanity. They pivot around two concerns, which I'm going to just broad stroke. The first one is on generating more accurate pictures of the production sites of anthropogenic effects. that have destabilized the biosphere and are mutating the Earth system. So in essence, who exactly is to blame? And the second, focus on unveiling the ideological baggage that often creeps into anthropocenic discourses, from the planetary managerialism that certain scientists champion to the technological bias that replaces the central place of struggle in the production of history with the appearance of certain artifacts, such as the atomic bomb, which is, right, scientists have agreed that marks the beginning of the Anthropocene. What we want to ask is not what ideological contraband slips into Anthropocenic discourses, but rather, what is it that our fixation on full extinction is pushing out of view? What concrete current event is being put out of place? What imminent extinctions, what slow-motion genocides currently on their way are being concealed by our fascination with the future extinction of the anthropos and the discursive and symbolic production it sustains? What questions are cast aside regarding how our existing spatial arrangements, urban, regional, hemispheric, global, entail an uneven distribution of burdens in relation to planetary shifts? All right, so this section is called the necessary stereoscopic exercise. Well, one of the tendencies in the imagination of climate change is to produce objects that allow us to sense the Anthropocene. Right, that's the guiding kind of argument in anthologies like Art in the Age of the Anthropocene and things like that. Another is to induce rereadings of existing cultural artifacts that distance them from discursive neighborhoods in which they reside and from the meanings which have accrued around them. So a good example of that would be someone like Nicholas Mirsov has a text called Visualizing the Anthropocene, where he rereads late 19th century and early 20th century and concludes that modernism is an education in how not to see the Anthropocene. So the authorization to do this, right, to reread existing cultural artifacts away from their discursive neighborhoods, is driven by an urgent impulse. Certain objects, thought anew, scanned through unexpected lenses or methodologies related to deep time, long duration, planetary and extraplanetary dimensions, or to molecular and isotopic levels where carbon transacts, where the acidification of the ocean and the recomposition of the atmosphere happen, can perhaps be instructive in conveying the magnitude of our current predicament. While, of course, there's a well-established way in which the work of someone like Alan McCullum is understood, and we may risk mystification when straying from it insofar as we'd be leaving behind the self-reflective moment in which the object unmasks the very contradictions that mark its existence in a world of general equivalence. The imagination of climate change softens the impediment to put the object at the service of discussions beyond those that generally surround it. And it does this in such a way that the enterprise no longer seems to need to struggle for legitimacy. As I began working on this presentation, relating McCullum's shapes to the morphological substratum of the organic, I kept thinking of the work of Paul Gilroy, who has enlisted biotech imaging advances, the visualization of the subepidermal, to disempower racial discourses and to trouble race out of sight. So Gilroy writes, this is a long quote, "The call of racial being has been weakened by a different technological revolution, by the idea that the body is nothing more than an incidental moment in the transmission of code and information, by its openness to new image technologies. Can we agree that the 18th century perceptual regimes that gave us race have been superseded along with their epistemological and metaphysical pretensions? In a space beyond and below that of comparative anatomy, the whole integral body and its obvious functional components no longer delimit the scale upon which assessments of the unity and variation of the species are made." See another quote. "Imaging technology, as it moves us downwards and inwards, confirms yet again that the naked eye is insufficient in determining what there really is. Without a doubt, imaging tech products facilitate an understanding of the body as a physical object comprised of a number of imperceptible systems. They cast us in what I earlier called negative relief. But while the eye may be insufficient to the task of determining the constituent elements of the human body or the species, this eye, nonetheless, as part of the human sensorium that has been educated, fine-tuned, and even or specially weaponized as the spear point of an immense conceptual matrix, continues to serve as a central component of the perceptual regimes that determine how bodies are socially engaged and valued. It is for this reason that someone like Jared Sexton contends that the production of molecular images, accompanied by the proliferation of interracial bodies in the social field, will have the opposite effect that may be suggested by Gilroy's general take. There will be a more intense policing of skin, more deliberate efforts to determine who falls on what side of the color line, and apply the burdens and benefits that such a determination entails. Sexton is among a number of younger thinkers endeavoring to trouble some of Gilroy's optimistic conclusions. Simone Brown is another one. She has worked on showing how when we turn from biotech and medicine, which is the fields that Gilroy uses to support his argument, when we turn from biotech and medicine to other fields in which new instruments redistribute the reading of the body away from its outward appearance, fields such as biometric surveillance, we confirm that the break from the perceptual is partial or intermittent. Processes of what Simone Brown calls, building on Frantz Fanon, digital epidermalization abound in these fields. The concept of epidermalization is developed by Fanon and numerous thinkers in his wake, names the production of the black and colonial body recast as a kind of ontological amputation, an entity divested of the possibility to understand its own inherent integrity, corporeal but also subjective, in relation to the world around it. Everything about this body is determined from the outside. Scrutinizing the field of biometric surveillance, Brown finds the process of digital epidermalization active at various locations. Firstly, at the moment of determining the protocols of the system that will capture the biometric data. As Brown shows, parsing research and development reports from the field, it is the parameters of the white body, right, skin tone, spacing of features, etc., which often provide the baseline. What are called fail rates of entry, in essence the failure of the system to capture data, increase, again according to technical information drawn from the field, in relation to certain physical types, producing a gradient of legibility that corresponds to particular physiognomic features and skin tones. Base parameters and protocols activate the machine-body interfaces as epidermalizing procedures are at work. Furthermore, biometric surveillance, when employed in certain sites, such as airports and border crossings, often includes a number of interfacial moments in which human-to-human contact is part of the chain of verification. At these points, the body as data is reconsolidated into meat and bones and recentered in a perceptual regime. And this is often accompanied by a decision-making power, say that of a customs officer or a border agent, that overrides what the captured biometric data may be signaling. Epidermal policing, then, is not necessarily eradicated when newer ways of visualizing the body beyond or below the anatomical level are activated. It seems one needs to be cautioned when valuing subepidermal visualizations of the body at the expense of other forms of understanding it. Saying this is not the same as challenging the advances of biotech as advances, or the larger claim that our scientific image has and will continue to refine our self-understanding and our self-conceptions. It's rather a way of proposing the force of these advances has not consolidated enough to displace the perceptual regimes that continue unperturbed to process and sort biological substance into racial categories, which in turn authorize levels of suspicion, debasement, devaluing, and violence, and modulate modes of engagement and behavior. The evidence of this fills our media feeds on a daily basis. We have not yet been relieved of the need to integrate at least two very different ways in which bodies are registered. The task is to attempt a stereoscopic exercise that can hold multiple conceptions of who we are in mind at once. In this way, we continue to refine ontological understanding and develop new normative and political claims while retaining the tools to survive in a social field shaped by white supremacist impulses. The point of this quick detour into the work of Gilroy and others is to set the background for the proposal that stereoscopic exercises as strategic hacks should also be at the core of the imagination of climate change. The demand for them should equally pressure our fascination with extinction. Long duration and vast scale concerns should be met with the injunction to attend to the ways in which the burdens of climate change fall unequally on different populations based on already existing ontological and spatial distributions. The fairy tale of an undifferentiated humanity should be met with facts like the climate gap. The climate gap was defined in a study in 2014 in California as, and I quote the study, the disproportionate and unequal impact the climate crisis has on people of color and the poor. That's the end of the quote. Heat waves, polluted air, increased prices for basic necessities, loss of jobs, stress infrastructure. They all tie back to planetary shifts, but have more egregious impact in the immediate circumstances of certain communities. The climate gap is determined through the collection of data in particular locations. It is, in this sense, even as varying versions of it can be found throughout the globe, a local phenomenon. But it demands the irrevocable gluing of local instance to global whole, of the neighborhood to the atmosphere, teaching us that part of the explanatory richness of far-off and below-the-surface explorations resides in their capacity to be involved in stereoscopic exercises. The therapeutic utility of pondering human extinction should be pressured to assume the political task of attending to current instances of human eradication and even endangerment. All right, so this is the last part. It's called Testing the Prototype. And it starts with two quotes from Alan McCullum. The first one says, "So I like it very much the story functions as a parable, in some way for the act of pulling things up from the deep." And the second quote says, "I want to try to depict ideas of vast quantities and vast differences, and then we could talk about them." So testing the license that the imagination of climate change to apply swerves in our revisions of culture artifacts, this encumbering us of the worry that we may be instrumentalizing them too egregiously, perhaps behooves us to ask here, where would we begin to attempt a stereoscopic reading of the Shapes Project? The first demand, I think, is to tether it back to our historical moment, to back up to the surface. After all, we're enlisting the work to aid us in articulating things that draw the urgency from the conjuncture itself. The Shapes projects can continue on one register to be an allegory of universal mutational restlessness, just as it retains conventional art historical understanding. But on a different register, incongruously perhaps, it can take us elsewhere. McCullum's interviews are peppered with references to community initiatives, with his interest in the kinds of collectibles that are valued outside of elite spaces, with his poor class background and the class structure more generally, with mentions of his desire for distributive models closer to potlatch than market transactions, functioning at the level of everyday life. In fact, when the Shapes Project was first exhibited, the shapes were billed as, and I quote, "gifts, awards, identity markers, emblems, insignias, logos, toys, souvenirs, educational tools, and so forth," end of quote, pointing to realms that exist light years from the institutional context that McCullum's early work fixated on. And the black and white monoprints that were showcased in this first presentation were accompanied by an analogous cookie-cutter shapes sourced from a home-based business. Subsequently, an iteration of the Shapes Project developed in the town of Hamilton, Maine, an iteration of the Shapes Project was developed in the town of Hamilton, Maine, in what resembled more a community project than an artistic event. Everyone took their shape home. In a section dedicated to Al's Cafe, 1969, in a catalog text, McCullum praises Alan Ruppersberg for his unwavering ability to value the common. And this is a quote from the catalog. "In my memory, it was Al who reminded our troubled generation that simple, normal, everyday rituals of commerce," he's talking about paying for a meal that someone makes for you. All right, so everyday rituals of commerce contain a significant complement of decency and joy that needed to be recognized and appreciated, not in spite of, but along with whatever else might have been wrong with the world during those uneasy years. That's the end of the quote. These snippets that I've been going through bridge a constant in McCullum's thinking. Tracing this permanent concern with the quotidian not only reveals a lacuna in the critical literature dedicated to McCullum, right, a failed rate of entry in the system, but it may, if we cease to neglect it, embolden us to pressure limits attributed to the work. If the everyday is the charged pole that pulls the project away from the rarefied air of the museum and its steering elite class, that allows for the pressuring of protocols of cultural consumption and object circulation, and that feeds McCullum's project at some subterranean level, then perhaps the quotidian in its dimension fullness, something about the labor of the miners who dug the dinosaur tracks in Utah, or the shared taste of people who take home and frame blobs, finds itself in some way reflected or addressed by the work in return. Perhaps in the very taste that stands behind McCullum's selection of objects to copy. A dinosaur track is not a Burberry coat. McCullum's McCollum's is a taste, like Robert Smithson's, leavened in paycheck-to-paycheck households full of mail-order boxes of fossils and microscope kits. It's a taste different in each that drives him to connect the immediate and the long view, to meld paleontological and the prehistoric with current critical strategy. In McCollum's case, both natural copies from the coal mines of central Utah and lost objects from 1991, which is composed of cast reproductions of fossil dinosaur bones, do this. McCollum has said about them, and I quote, "I wanted to produce an object that carries with it a deeper scope of time, the scope of time which obliterates history." This is a sensibility that also prides itself, as comment after comment attests, with being able to register unevenness in the social plane and then knowing who to side with. The miners in Utah, obviously, and not the elite in the boardroom. Thinking of McCollum's obstinate concern with the quotidian, one asks a question that may shake its usual center of gravity without putting it in another orbit. What is these days the most intense point in the plane of everyday life? What seems to demand address or reflection most urgently? What has become the most charged attractor of our attention? Whether this attention is politicized or indifferent hardly matters, if not the fatal transaction between young black and indigenous bodies and the police, and the policing which finds its deadly force in corroded pipes, in ruining natural resources, in the expropriation of land, in the imposition of debt, in diabetes epidemics, in the disregard for things like the climate gap in discourse and in life. So Ferguson, but also Flint and Cannonball, South Dakota, and Cajamarca, Peru. Maybe the SHAPE project can put us, or put itself, in the vicinity of bodies that under certain conditions of asymmetrical power are constantly besieged and violated because they're cast as blobs of a sort, as abject shapes opposite to bodies that can claim full-fledged personhood. These abject bodies lose their form, ontologically speaking, not because we've gone downward and inward with them, but because they have been structurally slaughtered at the very edges or beyond them of civil society and any understanding of the human as such. These bodies find themselves in our moment also cast as redundant and therefore disposable in relation to the reigning mode of production and its social reconfigurations. The mechanisms developed to relieve whatever pressure they put on a socioeconomic sphere that can no longer guarantee the reproduction of their lives are nefarious and obvious, from an expanded carceral complex to a continued eradication of cultural markers. And these so there's no disputing that McCollum's work functions as decoys, blanks, vehicles, and surrogates. What we may refuse to take for granted is that it serves as decoys, blanks, vehicles, and surrogates exclusively in relation to artworks or to the artwork as such as a commodified entity, or more recently, to other cultural artifacts. Repetition in McCollum's body of work, as the late Craig Owens pointed out early on, and I quote, inaugurates an indefinite play of substitutes, classification, reversals, and that's the end of the quote. But it does this not only as he goes on to propose to suspend any reference outside itself in order to point to the market structure in which the work is embedded. The shapes and the shapes projects are, or can be, surrogates of themselves too, as they have been petrified in the discourse. Owens argued that the marginal difference in the units that comprise McCollum's work are reifications of the marginal difference that sustains the serial production of the commodity economy, the difference that makes no difference. But here I want to argue instead for a marginal difference found in the constant and politicized presence of the quotidian in all this, and also in the constant and politicized challenge to modes of circulation that reproduce class structure in the object world. A marginal difference that renders the artwork different from itself, from its traditionally assigned function. It is the difference that, when located, opens an antinomic cleave at the very core of the artwork, through which we can see that the problem of the commodity, in a world beyond the sanctified halls of the art institution, is indivisible from a racial capitalism. And in the gap between the reading that the disciplinary constables guard and the one we're attempting here, we can slot in this reminder. One of the ways in which bodies lose human resolution is through the nefarious operation of turning them into chattel, rendering them available to fungibility and endless vulnerability. And with the passing on of the unfathomable damage that this does onto generations that come after through institutional protocol, skewed jurisprudence, and sheer terror. One senses a strange operation afoot here. It may be that if McCollum's work, leveled and interleaved with the everyday, sheds some light on the times, it is the times that impose a grid through which the work may structure a new geometry of expression. Meaning is exposed in the flash of an intense demand to be acknowledged that a moment of social upheaval puts out, inclining the work through sheer force to excavate its own latent tendencies. It is a demand that the work in turn demands to address, even if by disordering itself, the object, in these circumstances, if we can be forgiven the anthropomorphizing metaphor, is bewildered by what it is undergoing as a kind of out-of-body experience, haunted by capacities it didn't know it possessed, by flickers of what may be its slippery political unconscious, the possibility that the entirety of the human population it will generate a unique shape for does not, on an ontological plane, share a general equivalence. Before they are individuals with full claim to humanity, in parallel to being momentary coagulations in universal morphological unfolding, certain bodies are differentiated precisely by how they're slotted in a gradient of value that has the full-fledged human as modeled on a Western and white liberal prototype as its apex and as the collective agent that in turn determines its ascriptions of value and personhood, structuring things down to the very distribution of extinction before the final cataclysm.